Thank you, Andrew. Just two things that I want to say at this point, and I told the ambassador this morning, to his great disappointment. When we talk about James Hoban, when we started the Hoban commemoration, the common assumption was that he was born in 1762, which makes him the same age as Saint or Blessed Edmund Ignatius Rice, the founder of the Christian Brothers. But at some stage, John Riley, who is very detailed in his approach to these things, said to me, after we had spent some enormous sum on commemoration events, are we absolutely sure that this is the 250th anniversary of Hoban's birth? Because we were celebrating that in 2008. And I said to John Riley, with all the authority I possessed at that time, that we were absolutely certain that in Hoban's obituary in 1831, it said clearly that he was 73 years of age, and even John and I, with our limited mathematical knowledge, could subtract 73 from 1831, and we came up with 1758. Well, as I told the ambassador today, last year, the baptismal records for Kilkenny in the years 1755 to 1760 were released. And there, very clearly, was the date of birth of James Hoban and the correct names of his parents. And we know now that he was born in April 1755. So to all those of you who participated in the commemoration of James Hoban's 250th anniversary of his birth, I apologize unreservedly. The second thing is this, and I'm not very clear on the exact vintage of photography, but Desert Court, which Andrew showed you there, the photograph of Desert Court is indeed a desert court, built in 1733 and burned by the forces of the Irish Republican Army in 1921-22 during the Civil War, which we had in Ireland at that time, and we're now taking down all the monuments that we put up to the losing side in that war, because that seems to be the thing to do. But anyway, it is also true, and I'm not sure when that photograph came from, that it was then completely rebuilt in exact detail. And the story of the deserts in those times I haven't studied in recent times, except to say that there was a lady desert. They were entitled people. There was a lady desert down into the 1950s and 1960s. But somewhere along the line, the difficulty of maintaining the house became too great for the family. There were never a substantial family after the house was burned. And so, because there was rates relating to the keeping of the house, they decided to vacate it. And then they decided to take the roof off in order to recapture the lead that was in the roof. And ultimately, the house was knocked into its basement by local people. In fact, I spoke to the man who now since dead, who lived nearby, who was there at the knocking in. And poor William Seal, in this emotional journey that we make with the Hoban movement, has been so traumatized by that he keeps sending me emails saying, could we not dig out the basement and see what the layout of that fine house was and have it as a monument to Hoban? And I have to keep telling him that it probably will never happen. But anyway, we move on now to what was the second part of the program. And in that second part, we were going to focus entirely on people and people's relationship with Washington and with the White House and with the presidency, and more focus more on personal experiences than on architecture. And in all of these presentations, in the 4 presentations that follow, we have what I determined over the period of 15 years that I was studying Hoban were truly astonishing developments in people's relationship with the tradition of Irish architecture in Washington as established by Hoban, the Irish connection to the White House, and eventually a return of skill from Washington to Ireland in the way that James Hoban had brought his skill to America. So that in each of the following presentations, we're having really the selection of the flowering of that connection and that knowledge. And the first person, maybe not the first person I actually encountered in this little journey who struck me forcibly, but certainly did strike me forcibly ultimately, was a lady from North Carolina who wrote a book based on the researches she had made into her great-grandfather's life. And I've spent a long time studying the way Irish Americans look at their past and how they trace their past. And in fact, the great secret of Irish America is that they're actually much better at it than the Irish. They're a little naive sometimes, but they go the distance. And a lot of the good information that we have found on Irish figures in Washington's history and in American's history comes from the research that Americans have done by going to Ireland or by going to the internet and making those discoveries. But in any case, this woman went further. She took the details of the life she had found about her great-grandfather, who was a doorkeeper at the White House, and therefore mixing at the highest level, because in those days the White House was a pretty small establishment. There was your staff did not take private planes to go to their destinations in those days, because there were no private planes and the staff of the White House was so small, and they were intimate friends of the president. But this woman produced a book, a copy of which I believe she has here today. And I made it my business to go to North Carolina to meet her, and was even more impressed when she told me the story of what she had done. And she's here to tell us a little bit about it today. Without illustrations, those of you on the technical end will be glad to hear. Kathie Wycoff.
Well, thank you, Dennis, for that nice introduction. I feel a little out of place here today with all you polished and distinguished speakers. I consider myself more of and I hope I say this right, a Shanachie, an Irish storyteller and historian. But I am a fifth-generation Washingtonian, and I've been asked to speak today about Martin Renehan, who was an early White House doorman. Now, my grandfather was Martin's grandson. And just to give you an idea of how local I feel like I am, let me ask first, those who have a direct relationship with Martin. I know we have some more of these great-great-granddaughters and even further down the line. Would you stand up for a moment, please? Now, how about those of you who are native Washingtonians? And that's everybody. So we have a few more even. So thank you very much. Because we consider this our city. And we're happy that you're here. So who was this Martin, and how did he become an historical figure, especially since he was an immigrant from Kilkenny, Ireland? Well, in 1834, he was 24 years of age, and he had a girlfriend there named Margaret Hogan, and her sister was Mary Catherine, and the two of them decided that they were going to America. Now, they were in Knockembawn, right outside of Kilkenny, and at the time, Martin was closer to Dublin. So when the two of them decided to go, they had to go from Kilkenny to Dublin to Liverpool to America. And Martin decided he was going to surprise them. So as they were sailing out of Liverpool on the Russell Baldwin after a couple of days, he surprised them by coming up to them on the boat. Martin had two, and they're here today, two of Martin's grandchildren. My grandfather and his sister Grace lived, of course, in D.C. Well, Grace housed two of Martin's daughters for a number of years. The first was their mother, Annie, and the second was Agnes, the maiden aunt. So I feel very good about the information that I have gotten from them about him and his life in Ireland. She said Martin was a botanist at Maynooth College in Ireland. Now, research tells me that Martin, in his first job in D.C., was working as a writer at the various D.C. newspapers. But he was also the Washington correspondent for the Truth Teller, which was an Irish New York newspaper. But in 1837, in the last year of Andrew Jackson's presidency, Martin was hired as the White House doorkeeper, a position he held for the next 4 presidents and kind of a little bit into Zachary Taylor's. But he was also a friend to Franklin Pierce and to Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln. He always worked for the government after that, but not in the position as doorkeeper. After 10 years of in-depth research here and in Ireland, I wrote Ireland to America, my historical fiction novel on the life of my Martin. And I'd like to share with you some of the things I learned about him, particularly as it pertains to the White House. Now, there's an interesting story, as Pat is still here, Pat, that just talked this morning. You just talked this morning, because I have Martin being hired very late in Jackson's term. And I didn't really know why, and then I found a story that reads identical to yours on Jemmy Mayer, which we talked about as being perhaps an anti-Irish sentiment. But my story said Jimmy drank heavily and Jackson had many complaints. And so we think maybe that's why Martin might have gotten hired. But Jimmy was still a very good friend of Jackson's. They were both fellow Irishmen. And he accompanied him when he went to his home in the Hermitage in Knoxville, Tennessee. So when Martin Van Buren took office, my Martin had only been in the White House there in that position for a few months. So what was Martin Renehan like? Well, he was short in stature. Many stories will tell you that. He spoke with a heavy Irish accent, so memorable that his quotes are almost always written in an Irish brogue. He's been cited for his quick wit, his talkativeness, his obliging manners, which contributed to his ability to make many friends, including some of the leading men of the country. Today I'm going to concentrate on the 6 roles of the doorman as they applied to Martin. As you listen to them, I think you can easily see how these jobs now are done by multiple agencies and many employees. First, we know Martin was assigned to live at the White House. He had a key. He saw people come in and go out. The doorman, however, was expected to receive the president's approval before he granted access for a personal meeting. Second, the doorman was expected to be available and punctual. He had continual access to the president and has been called the valet, an usher, confidential advisor, trusted personal servant, and a man of all work. Third, the president relied on him to be present at all affairs, either in the room or within hearing distance. He could be called upon at a moment's notice. And fourth, no matter his party affiliation, the doorman was expected to protect the president from people and situations that could be a danger. Now, the 5th role I have listed is questionable. It was the role of informant, as I will explain later. And lastly, I have one unexpected part of his job position. When Martin was doorman, there was always someone at the door. It was the people's house. Anyone could come and go. To see the president, however, you could only hope the doorman would provide access. Most stories about doormen are oral history, and I feel really fortunate that most of Martin's stories have been written down and recorded. In an account written in 1844 by George Moore, he gave a very detailed description of his visit to the city and the president's house during President Tyler's term. And in part, he says, "It was shown to us by Martin Renehan, an Irishman. And as the president was absent, we visited all the rooms, which were meanly furnished. The carpets and chair bottoms were worn out, and they had a common pine dining table. The president's house was truly a house of the people, and they could come and go as they pleased, and many took souvenirs, and consequently, the draperies were ragtag along with much of the furniture. Now, his description goes on, but I sort of like to think of Martin as an early masculine version of Jacqueline Kennedy, you know, showing people through the White House, except he didn't have a television. A doorman had many expectations and unexpected obligations. He lived in the lodge room to the right of the north door, where he would sit at his desk and keep records. The lodge room, although rebuilt, as you've heard, is still there today. But I've never been able to access these records, even if they still exist. But they ought to be very valuable if they could be found, because he was like a personal secretary. Now, there's a story about John Tyler worth telling, and it takes place on an evening when the Marine Band played on the lawn and it began to rain. Tyler invited the entire crowd into the White House and told Martin, "Make them comfortable. See about feeding them, Martin. See that refreshments are handed round." When these wet guests came in, it was written that Martin, the little Irish porter, was as busy as if he had been at a shillelagh frolic in Ireland. One of the most repeated stories about Martin is from the beginning of President Harrison's short term, and it goes something like this. General Harrison was an early riser. Martin went upstairs gently, tapped on his door, and received an invitation to enter. The general was sitting near the fire, in which there were a few expiring coals. "Is it possible," Martin said, "the weather being so cold that you have no fire?" He replied, "Martin, when at home, I was accustomed to a wood fire, and if I had wood now, I would replenish this fire myself." Martin responded that he would supply the needed fuel and added, "An elderly gentleman, sir, has been repeatedly calling here. He's of respectable appearance and unassuming in his manners, and has elicited my sympathies. I therefore take the liberty of asking whether you will now give him a private audience." "Where is he?" "In the green room." "Show him up," said the president. Martin did so, and then retired to give the stranger the full benefit of a strictly private interview. When the visitor had left, Martin returned to the president's room. "Martin," said the president, "have you been kind to that man?" "I have. I took him by the hand." "Are you aware," said the president, "that he's looking for your place?" Martin replied, "Your Excellency, I expected to go, as I am opposed to you in politics." Mr. Harrison said, "John Quincy Adams told me all about you, and as long as I remain in the White House, the cabinet can't even remove you." Renehan responded, "I am the last Martin in the nest. I thought you were going to put me to flight." "No, no," the president said. "Two Martins have already been banished from this house," meaning Martin Van Buren and his son. "And it would be bad luck to banish you, the only remaining Martin. So you stay and nestle in the battlements." Now, this story has a different spin in another book. This one has Martin, not Harrison, making the play on words. It indicates Martin is hoping to save his job during the new administration. And it says that when General Harrison came to the White House, Martin addressed him with, "Please, Your Honor," and I wish I could say this the way you wonderful people can, "they say you're going to make a clean sweep. I'm the last Martin in the nest. Must I take wing?" Harrison replied, "No, Renehan, they say 'tis ill luck to drive the Martins from where they build. Stay where you are." Now, I have a third source yet for this story, and this one is from an article in the Evening Star in 1908. And this one gives the president as Tyler. It says, "Martin averted threatened dismissal by asking Tyler if he intended to drive the last Martin from the box. So is this Martin saving his job again, or is this just a third spin on the first story? Either way, I wanted to include it because it shows how much of an impression Martin made as his stories continue to be told over and over, despite the fact that he died in 1884. Now, as I said earlier, the doorman was expected to be present or close by at all functions. This one is an embarrassing situation for Martin that turned into a great story, and it's about a telescope. Martin, while fixing things to right in the garret, which I had to look up as a attic room or top floor room, anyway, he found this old telescope and he laid it aside for future use. One evening, the stars shining brightly, the sky unclouded, and while President Tyler was entertaining the cabinet and foreign representatives at dinner, Martin, having nothing else to do except to stay close to the presidential activities, brought down his old telescope and mounted it on a table in the southern portico. But when he tried to use it, he couldn't see any better than he could with his naked eyes. And a long time elapsed while he tried to get the focus before he discovered there was no glass in it. The thing that he called it, he talked to it. In earnest words to himself, he expressed his disappointment and his displeasure, using more than a few emphatic adjectives. Daniel Webster, meantime, decided to come out to the south portico for a breath of fresh air. As he stood behind Martin, his hands deep down in his pockets, he observed Martin attentively and listened to his imprecations on the telescope and his confusion to get the focus. Martin accidentally turned around and saw Mr. Webster, who said, "Why, Martin, can't you see anything?" Martin was much embarrassed on discovering that his complaint and his address to the telescope had been heard by Mr. Webster. But soon recovering his self-possession, Martin, with his usual ready wit, said, "Mr. Webster, I have been disappointed. I can't, as I wished, contemplate the heavenly bodies, but I am equally gratified in seeing an earthly luminary before me now." Well, Mr. Webster was so well pleased with what he had witnessed and heard that he returned to the company and related accurately the entire story to the delight of the dinner party. Now, I think it's nice, first of all, that somebody at that party preserved this story for us. But Martin's, and what I read about him, reminds me of the old Irish saying that the only thing that ever got in front of an Irishman was a wheelbarrow. Now, I'm going to return to President Tyler. He always seems to provide the best stories. When he assumed the presidency on Harrison's early death, the entire political system was in turmoil. Now, if you remember, Harrison died after only 1 month in office, so Tyler was the very first vice president to assume the presidency, and it was a little unclear as to what was really supposed to happen at that point. So it was a difficult and a sometimes dangerous time, and Martin was there for the transition. An early story gives a view of the protective duties of the doorman. It was told by Lawrence Gobright, who interviewed Martin himself in 1869. Now you have to remember this is not Martin's political party, and it goes something like this. President Tyler was the recipient of a small wooden box. There was no note and no one with sufficient courage to open the box after it had been whispered it might be an infernal machine. As the alarm of the little group, consisting of the president, a uniformed Captain Wagaman, plus a servant, rose to a fearful height, Martin was summoned into this great crisis. And he came with quick breathing and hurried step, and soon learned the cause of the commotion. "Your Excellency," he said with an apparently serious look, "does well to be cautious in these high party times. The devil himself puts it into the heads of his children to manufacture infernal machines. And who knows but that powder and balls and percussion dust have been arranged with a view to blow you up for vetoing the bank bill." "True, true," remarked Mr. Tyler, receding a few steps and starting back as if it were on the eve of explosion. "But I'd like to see the contents, Martin." "By the powers," said the son of Aaron, "I'll chop it up in less than no time." And away he ran down to the kitchen, and picking up a meat cleaver, hastily returned to execute the purpose. Martin placed the box on a table, turned up his cuffs, and prepared for the work. Captain Wagaman retreated to a nook from which he could behold the operation without danger. The servant put his hands in front of his face as if to protect himself, and Mr. Tyler took refuge behind a huge pillar. In peeping around it, his nose, which was by no means small, was all the brave Irishman could see. "Martin, Martin, ain't you afraid?" asked the president. "No, sir," said Martin. "'Tis better for me to die than that the president should be killed by such a divil of a machine. My death is nothing compared to your excellencies." And Martin went to work. Every cut of the cleaver caused a winking of the eye and a cold chill. At last, after much hacking, the inside of the box was exposed, and the relief of the spectators was great when Martin put in his hand and took out the model of a stove. Mr. Tyler solemnly and emphatically counseled Martin not to talk about the matter, for if you do, they'll have me caricatured. Now, I found that story in several books, but I really doubt Martin was the first one to tell it. Supposedly now, a similar incident took place during President Polk's administration. Like Tyler, he received a strange box. Instead of showing symptoms of fear, he carelessly stepped aside 5 or 6 feet to spit, but didn't return to inspect the box. As before, Martin was called, and by permission, he opened the box and announced there was nothing in it but an old rust-eaten gun and without a lock. To relieve the president from his embarrassment, you have to remember this is Martin's political party. To relieve the president from his embarrassment, Martin tactfully remarked, "Perhaps, Your Excellency, some friend has sent this to you as a relic of the Revolutionary War." "Oh, yes," quickly said Polk. "I recollect. I received a letter from North Carolina just the other day advising me of the fact." It would seem that Martin kind of handed him a way to save face with all of this happening, and the president jumped on it. Well, I think I've covered the first 4 roles of the president. There's only 2 more. If you'll remember, I referred to the doorman as an informant. While I know Martin continued to be a freelance writer for the Truth Teller, there were no bylines for writers for articles published. The paper supported political writings, and Martin would have had knowledge of the workings of the White House, which he could have used to either support or to discredit the current administration. I've read as many of these old papers as I could find, but I can only suspect which articles he might have written, and my book gives an example of one he wrote about Henry Clay. I don't think he had a whole lot of use for the man. Our honored guest today, Mr. Seal, and also Margaret Truman, recorded this next story. It tells of a letter from James Paulding in President Van Buren's papers. It seems that Martin succeeded in discreetly passing information to Van Buren during Harrison's brief presidency. Martin spoke to Van Buren's old Secretary of War, who relayed the message to Paulding, who then wrote to Van Buren. Martin knew the cabinet had been meeting from 8 in the morning until 10 at night. Now, Margaret Truman says, and I quote her, "Renehan became a political mole, reporting back to party leaders that the new powers that be, the Whigs, were in the White House 12 hours a day, arguing with President William Henry Harrison over who got what in the spoils of his election victory." This is all the information we're given, but it seems likely Martin heard those voices and all the meetings that were going on, and he was opposed to Harrison politically. But then we read from Gobright, who supposedly recorded his stories directly from Martin, that Harrison was a good friend of Martin and made him a companion in all his private dealings. So again, which spin do you believe? And are they both maybe true? Now that brings me to the sixth and the last category of the job of doorman, at least for Martin. Other duties is assigned, to use today's terminology. Our family was fortunate to have had a number of personal stories from Martin's youngest daughter, Agnes, who, by the way, died in 1947 at the age of 93. Agnes said for a time her immediate family housed President Tyler's brother, Watt, who was an alcoholic and an embarrassment to the president. One story, Aunt Agnes told, was during an evening when they were saying the rosary at the front door as usual. Just as Watt entered, Martin, without turning from his family and in hopes of not being disturbed, announced loudly, "The fifth sorrowful mystery, the crucifixion." And an inebriated Watt said, "Yes, Martin, it is a mystery," and stumbled up the stairs. And Aunt Agnes reported they never missed a Hail Mary. Now, a second story from Aunt Agnes is about a son of Irish immigrants who was born in Georgetown, just up the road. You might recognize him. His name was William Corcoran. He was a visitor at the Renehan home, and Agnes reminded us that her father was a professor of botany in Ireland and had a fantastic backyard. He took Mr. Corcoran there, showed him a rose he had grafted to a pear tree. Turns out the two of them apparently were very good friends. Now, if you can bear with me a few more minutes, I have a second Irish connection to the stories of the White House and the presidents. When the west and the east wings of the White House were having major additions and improvements, first during Franklin Roosevelt's term, my dad, John Hayden Thomas, he was another Irishman, was employed by the electrical contractor on the job. He knew Eleanor Roosevelt, who would sometimes call to him by name. "Tommy, Tommy, Fowler's loose again." Fowler, as you may remember, was the Roosevelt's, the Scottish Terrier, so he used to have to catch him. The renovations eventually turned into the major reconstruction during President Truman's term. Now, in order to deliver paychecks and material, my dad would drive his truck right into the bottom of the gutted White House. He told of President Truman playing cards with the Secret Service men, and later of having an afternoon drink with Mamie Eisenhower because she would ask him to sit with her so she didn't have to drink alone. Now, and I have some friends here today from there who went to school with me, but when I attended high school at St. Cecilia's Academy at 6, it's at the corner of 6 and East Capitol Street. And my dad would drive me to school. He told me stories during those many commutes, and my mother recorded other stories too. Dad's mother used to work in the Capitol building for William Tyler Page, who you might remember wrote the American Creed, and he was also for a while the clerk of the House of Representatives. His dad was on the police force there. With both parents working in the Capitol, my dad had special permission to play there as a child. This was around 1921, when my dad was around 6 years old. He said he once got to sit on President Harding's lap, and he was given all the change in Harding's pocket, which was about 15 cents. He said it got recorded in the congressional record. My dad said he knew the fella who worked on the door of the Senate chamber. He'd give me a piece of candy when he saw me. And if he wanted to get his energy out on a rainy day, he would run around the dome of the Capitol, which I don't think you can do today. Now, getting back to Martin, it's impossible to write his job description. He's been called a doorman, but he was much more. He is a noteworthy immigrant Irishman who became an American citizen. In researching his stories, he becomes a versatile, intelligent, and a witty man who is much liked and sought after. It's been written that he was a true friend and a trusted advisor and confidant of the president's. He was a transitional team member, a spin doctor, a political mole, a valet, a social secretary, a protector, a general man Friday. His self-deprecating humor made him a favorite of Daniel Webster and many of the politicians and visitors of his era. His funeral was attended by past presidents and dignitaries, along with co-workers and the general public. Now, I've made a handout for you if you're interested. It gives you Martin and Margaret Renehan's obituaries. I think Martin's obituary was written in Margaret's too, but the way it reads. And I've included a short list of some of the books on other doormen, in addition to the one that I had written. In concluding, I hope you can see that my family and I have a rather long connection, not only to the White House, but also to this city. In growing up, it felt like a small town. And that brings up a question. How do we view history? Are we part of it, or is it part of us? Either way, I feel Martin left a footprint. He gave his best to his new country, and I'm sure he, like my father, would love to have been here during this celebration of the Irish connection within this, our city. So many thanks to you for coming to my city and being here today, for your interest in my family history. Thanks to my friend Dennis Bergen for this opportunity. And I gave you the same toast that Martin gave to Daniel O'Connor during a St. Patrick's Day celebration, so allow me to paraphrase. To Dennis Bergen, one of the purest and brightest gems in Ireland's diadem, may its luster never be dimmed by those who reflect whatever glory they possessed by being his countrymen. So thank you all again.